Hey, and welcome back to the channel, everybody. How are you all doing? One of my favorite elements of my motion simulator is my traction loss axis. And when you get your traction loss axis tweaked and fine-tuned, it is sublime. It is amazing. Now, coming from a guy who has a muscle car and loves his traction loss and his muscle car, I've got a certain level of traction loss that I'm aiming for in my motion simulator here. And because I regularly partake in traction loss in my real life muscle car, I've got a good idea of how traction loss should feel from that real life experience. Now, you might think that I'm about to launch into a video talking about sim tools. Well, you would be incorrect, because we're going to focus on SMC3 utilities and how that can be used on a game-by-game basis, and how you can basically set up SMC3 utilities with separate profiles and saves for particular games. What you got to remember, guys, is that every one of these simulation racing games that we play, they all have their individual physics engines written into them. Therefore, the data that they transfer to our motion sims via sim tools, it can vary quite a lot between games. This game that we're looking at here is the old school R Factor, the original R Factor. This is one of my favorite physics engines, and I don't care what anybody says about that it's outdated, etc. The experience I get in R Factor, and R Factor 2 for that matter, give me a lot more accurate and higher fidelity on my motion sim than I get out of Assetto Corsa, for example. In saying that though, by spending a little bit of time in Assetto Corsa and making adjustments in SMC3, in the PID loop, in my pulse width modulation, I can bring it up to a similar spec to what I'm getting in R Factor and R Factor 2. And I'm going to go through that very shortly. This is only a short video. We're going to look at SMC3 utilities, and I'm going to talk about some of the adjustments that can be made in SMC3 utilities to make your traction loss snappier, responsive, and getting the motion and the range out of it that you desire. And this applies to any axis, not just traction loss. Well, let's start with the PID loop. So what I've come up with R Factor 1 is a level of 350 in my proportional. I've got my integral all the way down to 1. I've got my derivative all the way down to 1. And I've got 5 points of smoothing. And that is what's working really nicely in R Factor in the PID loop. And this would be vastly different if we were to look at Assetto Corsa. And we'll get to that. I'll do a video on that to show you the differences. So over here in the pulse width modulation zone, my minimum pulse width I keep at 40 to keep a minimum of 40 in the voltage there. In my max and reverse, I have them the same. So my max pulse width modulation sits at 220 and my reverse sits at 220 for an even keel, so I'm getting even left, even right sweeping motions. So I'm just going to load up a really full-on profile that I've had that I needed to change because it was way too noisy having this particular profile set up for R Factor. And so what I've discovered with my endless hours of tweaking and fiddling around with SMC3 utilities as it relates to different games, what I've found is the main culprits are the integral and the derivative. If you have these too high with some games and not enough smoothing as well, okay, it can adversely affect how much noise comes through the data to sim tools, okay? It exaggerates things that are happening in the data in the game, in heave, in traction loss, in surge, and it can make those things really quite noisy, and it can just add too much of things that are not required. The same with the minimum pulse width modulation. Too much minimum pulse width modulation also can cause you pretty major dramas with the same sort of issues. So guys, there is not a lot of information out there available about this, and so I thought, why not throw something together? It might really help guys out there, because it's taken me a long time to work this out myself. So hopefully this will fast track you guys being able to tweak your motion sims and tweak your motion to be snappier and more accurate to what's actually happening in your games. You need to experiment with this. This is just a base I'm showing you now. Depending on your rig, depending on what your game is, it's all going to vary, and it just requires experimentation and creativity. within the boundaries that you need to keep all of your stuff safe. Okay, not overdoing it with your voltages and not overdoing it with your PID loop, heating up your motors, stressing out your motor controllers, etc., etc. Well, I will do a video at some stage and we'll have a look at Assetto Corsa as a point of difference from how it would be set up to how R-Factor set up, for example, to try and get similar motion and a similar snappy traction loss in Assetto Corsa that I have now managed to get from R-Factor. R-Factor always had the edge on traction loss over Assetto Corsa to begin with, but with tweaking in SMC3 utilities and that appropriate degrees of force in sim tools, you can get it pretty close to R-Factor or R-Factor 2. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I hope this has helped you. And until I see you in the next video, you stay safe, stay healthy, and take it easy out there.